the most accurate answer is that it's too soon to tell. I think there is the potential, certainly. I mean, you're absolutely right. And I think that, to the outside observer, we look very similar to people who are from one of these states. We couldn't be more disparate. It's very easy to spot the differences, when they're right under your nose. We always joke that Alabama's backwards, facing backwards. They and others use the expression, thank God for Mississippi, because if not for Mississippi, then we'd be last. So there's that sort of back and forth. I think that there are a few key differences. The biggest is that Alabama is and always has been much more urban than Mississippi, and also much more suburban. So in terms of groups of voters that we've seen really be the swing voters here in the last couple of years, the white suburban women in particular, who swung maybe Republicans at heart, but have voted for Democrats recently. I think that's just a larger voting bloc in Alabama than it is in Mississippi. So Alabama has, so I'm sitting in Jackson right now, the state capital of Mississippi, the largest city in Mississippi, and if Jackson were a city in Alabama, it would be the fifth largest city. So with that comes, I think, kind of by its nature, more organization and more ability to organize. I mean, it's just easier to organize people when they're in close proximity in Birmingham or in Montgomery. And Mississippi just doesn't have that. Our population is about 50% rural, which makes us the fourth most rural state in the country. So people are very spread out, and there's just not a lot of strong political institutions. We have strong bonds that sort of run through family and faith and community, but there's just never been a real strong political mobilizing effort, at least since desegregation. And so it makes the energy, which I do think is there. I think, certainly Mississippians, when we get our news and we follow things through the same sources as everybody in the rest of the country. And so that just the energy that we're seeing on the left nationally is certainly being felt here. But I think just because of the nature of the state, it is more diffuse, and so it is harder to take a real measure of. Now, the other, where I said, it may be too soon to tell, the Alabama Senate race, which, we may never see the likes of again, at least let's hope. The candidates were running for a long time, but it became a national race, and really it became so intensified just in the last few weeks when the national media poured in, when Roy Moore and Doug Jones became household names. And I think we're at a period in just the election cycle in Mississippi that is sort of prior to when that, if we see a sort of parallel influx, then that's not going to take place for a couple months. And I think really the most likely thing to actually bring that on and turn that special election for the Senate into an extremely closely watched, heavily scrutinized race would be if Mike Espy, if he advances to the runoff against either of the two Republicans, but particularly against Chris McDaniel, who I think he would have a much better chance of beating. And since that election is going to take place 3 weeks after everybody in America has already voted and every other race in the country has been cleared up, that election is going to be very closely watched. And if the balance of power in the Senate happens to hang on that, then I think that you will. I think that half of Washington, D.C. will move to Mississippi for 3 weeks. And so, if that happens, then all bets are off. But I think it does increase the possibility of a Doug Jones-style victory, surprise, upset victory taking place. And what how it actually will work out, the machinery of it. I mean, one is, when you have national media outlets doing investigation into the candidates, it was the Washington Post that wrote the story about Roy Moore. You just have investigative resources, journalistic resources brought to bear that in-state sources and the campaigns themselves don't have the ability to. And so you may have a game changer that arises out of that. It also could decrease the resource gap. So the Republicans are much better funded than the Democrats, just writ large in the state, but you also see that in this Senate race. If suddenly every time a Mississippian turns on CNN or MSNBC, probably for our listeners, or Fox News for others, and they see people talking about this Senate race, then it decreases the importance of that financial advantage. And so I see those as being two variables that would be really, that are contingent upon kind of where things stand on November 6th and who makes it into that final stage of the runoff.
We would be remiss if we didn't talk about the lottery in Mississippi, since we are recording this on Tuesday afternoon, just, very soon after the State House held a vote. So what's going on in the Mississippi State Legislature with the lottery? So
the lottery, Mississippi is one of 6 states that currently does not have a state lottery. And it's I think there's just been it's almost been impossible to imagine Mississippi adopting a lottery for a long time. It was, there was our governor in the early 90s made a really strong push for it. It failed. It was held up by some as the reason why he did not get reelected in 1991. So it was considered to be a third rail. We've also got a very powerful casino lobby in the state. They've historically been opposed to it. It's no coincidence that one of the other states that doesn't have a lottery is Nevada. And then we have a strong sort of evangelical religious population that, have been opposed to gambling on moral grounds. So it was just, it was pretty inconceivable. The people that have historically pushed for a lottery have been Democrats in order to generate more revenue for education. The people that opposed it have been Republicans because of the business ties, the casino ties, and the religious ties. And just in the last couple of days, all of that has gotten jumbled up and inverted. So the lottery has gotten rolled in to a bigger and more consequential issue in the state, and that is infrastructure funding. We have let our roads deteriorate to the point that in the last year, the federal government has closed 500 bridges around the state. Most of them they're actually, here in Jackson, just in my neighborhood, there are a few, but a lot of them are out in rural areas in which there's one road into town and one road out of town, and if you can't cross the bridge, then you got to drive an hour and a half out of your way. And so, but because of just structural deficiencies, lack of maintenance, we've seen this spate of bridge closings around the state. And so it's become a really dire issue. But as with many places, we are getting strong and have gotten strong pressure from Americans for Prosperity, the Koch brother-backed sort of libertarian pressure group, who have put the screws on some of our state leadership not to raise taxes in any way, including the gas tax, which is not indexed for inflation and would be a very logical way to fund roads. But they've had the pressure really put on them, and our lieutenant governor, who has designs on the governor's mansion next year, has really almost single-handedly for 2 years now blocked any additional funding to go to roads, either sort of state money that is funneled to cities and counties to maintain a lot of these roads a lot of these bridges that are being closed, as well as just basic state highway maintenance. And so that's become a real albatross around his neck as he's preparing for this run next year, compounded by the fact that it was discovered by the press recently that there was a special $2 million frontage road that was being built from his subdivision out in the Jackson suburbs to a mall that would allow him to not have to cross traffic to turn onto the road to get into Jackson. So, there's a personal component to this as well as a policy component. But yeah, so that's the big issue. Is like, how do we fix this mounting emergency in our roads with while also satisfying the out-of-state libertarian groups who will not support people who have passed a tax increase of any kind. And so they found several ways to square that circle. Two are the result of Supreme Court decisions recently. The first is allowing states to collect internet sales taxes. So this special session that we're in right now has diverted a portion of those future revenues to cities and counties for road repair. So the Supreme Court then authorized states to legalize sports betting. And our casinos were one of the first movers on that. And so, in preparation for college football season, you're seeing, the sports books setting up shop in our casinos. And so that's going to provide some revenue that they're going to divert to infrastructure. They borrowed a lot of money, split it on the state's credit card. And then finally, the final piece would be the state lottery. so really just out of desperation, it's overcome all of the sources of opposition in the past. And it's created really interesting bedfellows here. I mean, this is just in terms of political process, legislative process. I mean, this was something legislators were called back to session last Thursday. It's Tuesday currently. They had this 135-page bill dropped on their desk, and they were told immediately, okay, well, we need your votes on this. They said, well, hold up. Shouldn't we read it first? It passed the House originally, went over to the Senate. It was discovered that there were a lot of pretty shady things, like that the new lottery corporation was not going to be subject to public records laws, and there was a backlash for that, and there were some amendments, and it got pinged back over. Senate amended it, got pinged back over to the House, and it's just kind of gone back and forth, and legislators who expected to be in Jackson for a day or two are now here on fourth day in the session. The lottery went back to our House last night. They surprisingly voted it down because Democrats that had supported it ended up flipping against it, but it was a pretty mixed vote. There were 60 votes to kill it. 34 came from Republicans, 26 came from Democrats. But then it was held on a motion to reconsider, which means that it came back up for another vote today. And just a few minutes before we started talking, they were able to flip several votes and get it passed by a margin of 3 votes. But then I believe that might have been held on a motion, and so that's where I'm just going to say that the story continues. But it does look like the governor who is really pushing for this has cobbled together enough votes to pass the lottery, and so we shall be the 46th state in the country now. Now, I personally think it's really bad policy, and it's especially bad policy for to do so in a sort of act of desperation here and to tie it to roads instead of, as other states have done, college scholarships or pre-K, things that we desperately need. But I don't get to make the laws, so here we are.
Did at any point anyone suggest maybe the way to get some more money into the state would be taking the Medicaid expansion?
That's just too logical of a suggestion to make its way. The politics of Medicaid expansion have been, it is the proponents, of which there are many. It's pretty uniform support among Democrats and even, a number of Republicans, including our Republican state insurance commissioner, have come out in favor of it. Business groups have come out in favor of it. But our governor has been implacable on it, and there have been enough Republican legislators to vote it down every time that it's come up, either as an independent bill or as an amendment, that really in the last year or two, it's almost just faded from discussion. So what that is going to be resolved in next year's gubernatorial election. So I think that's the calculation that Democrats have made. There's just no way of getting it through with this legislature and with this governor, and so it's gonna have to be put to the people next year, the voters next year. So Democrats will be running certainly on Medicaid expansion. In fact, earlier today I just saw we had another rural hospital file for Chapter 11, which is the 5th in the state so far. So that there is certainly extreme need for it, both from people in Mississippi, but also from groups that have a little bit more political power and money and cachet. And so our likely, I'd say that the Democrats' likely gubernatorial candidate, who is currently the Attorney General, his name's Jim Hood. Medicaid expansion is going to be at the top of his agenda, much like John Bel Edwards in Louisiana, sort of other Southern Democrats that have had success, Roy Cooper in North Carolina. And so we'll see. Every poll that's been taken has shown broad political popular support for it, and yet that has not, just like broad popular support for raising gas taxes and putting more money into roads, but that has not translated into policy yet. So that's where that stands. It is extremely frustrating, and especially I think a lot of advocates. There are plenty of people in Mississippi who very strong health equity, health justice advocates, people who are healthcare providers who have not stopped talking about this. I think other progressive advocacy groups have seen just when you're fighting on a lot of fronts that they've put their attention elsewhere. But next year will be the time that it goes back into center stage.
Is there anything else you want to make sure our listeners know about Mississippi politics?
So in our email exchange before this, you mentioned a question I think is very interesting. Just how is the state that has the largest share of black population also have a Confederate flag on its state flag? And I think that the right the right way to answer that question is that